Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yishmael Hawkins. Well, we've got some earthquakes that are shaking things up in Southern California. It's been nearly 2 decades since they've had an earthquake, and especially one of this magnitude. Iran's resistance to pressure continually being put on them by the United States. They're kind of giving an air of, listen, we are not going to just sit back and take this, lying down. And of course, Putin's latest meeting with the Pope and his timeliness. Well, first we're going to start off with the fact that it's hard to find anyone who isn't taking prescription medications these days, but have they become the solution or just fueling an even bigger problem? Prescription drugs are designed to alter the way our brains feel pain and even emotions. But did you know drugs affect another brain in our bodies? Let's take a listen to what RT's The Resident has learned about this very thing.
So many people take psychotropic drugs these days, antidepressants or anti-anxiety medicines, drugs that affect people's mental states. So many people are on them these days, to the point where the global market is worth billions and billions of dollars. And all of these drugs are designed to alter your mental state by doing stuff in your brain, right? That big melon inside our skull. These drugs are designed to mess with our brains so that we don't feel emotions we don't like, so that we can keep on living the lives we want to, regardless of whether or not our melons are trying to tell us that maybe we should be doing things differently. It's a pretty crazy prospect if you think about it, really. And I just read some news that makes the whole thing even crazier. According to a new report in Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, drugs don't just affect the brain in your head, they also affect the brain in your gut. Drugs don't just affect the brain in your head, they also affect the brain in your gut. The brain in your gut. The brain in your gut. Yeah, that's right. We humans have entire ecosystems of bacteria and a massive neural network that operates in our guts. Scientists have only touched upon our understanding of how it works. And they say that this second brain doesn't think or reason, but we do know it affects our mood. And now, according to this new report, we know that it actually affects the efficacy of the drugs we take for the brain in our head, too. Researchers looked at a drug for Parkinson's, and they found that one kind of bacteria that can be found in our gut brain can actually convert that drug into dopamine. And then another kind of bacteria can convert that into metatyramine, which can create the known side effects for the drug. And because of that, the bugs in our guts can actually either stop the drug from reaching the brain in our skulls or alter them into something else altogether. In other words, when we pop a pill, it's not just the one brain being affected, it's both. And brains in our guts might be driving the train on how those drugs end up working. Now, I'm not just a flat-out anti-drug person. I think some people do need help functioning. But I'm also a big believer in listening to what our gut brains tell us, or more specifically, the bugs in our guts. If you ask me, there's way too much focus on drugs and way too little focus on the bugs in our scientific community. We know that the bugs drive an entire second brain, but we barely talk about them.
What I found interesting in there, Katan, is that the bacteria in our gut has the ability to alter or even stop it from reaching the drugs, from reaching the person's brain. So that really shows you the intelligence there in the gut bacteria and the ability, as the resident was saying there, to have a brain and think to know what to do with those drugs.
And scientists have been trying for many, many years to kind of latch hold of what's in the gut to have access to the brain, because it is such a well-guarded system.
Right. Well, Southern California was hit by another quake just one day after a 6.4 magnitude hit the region. Now, this one was a 7.1 on the Richter scale and was centered in Ridgecrest, but felt as far away as New Mexico and Nevada. Now, roads were closed and buildings were damaged. Gas lines ruptured, sparking numerous fires. Now, California's OES director, Mark Ghilarducci, said that there have been numerous emergency calls that have come in, and there are huge priorities right now for medical support, fires, and emergency power. Now, even in Los Angeles, that magnitude 7.1 quake was felt, interrupting a live news broadcast, forcing the news anchors to take cover under the news desk. Now, this quake was just one day after July 4th's 6.4 quake that was the largest to hit the area in 2 decades. Now, it turns out that earthquake was just a foreshock. And while residents and business owners were cleaning up from Thursday's quake, the big 7.1 rattled not only buildings, but nerves as well.
Yeah, that's right. One business owner of a convenience store said that he lost about $100,000 worth of merchandise and doesn't have insurance to cover earthquake damage. So far, no reports of injuries or deaths, but experts say that aftershocks will likely continue for some time. And they're saying that even people who do have earthquake insurance usually don't get the coverage they need to replace or to fully rebuild in those situations. Well, police body cam footage has recently been released showing the killing of a knife-wielding man who charged at police officers, taunting them to shoot him. In the video, you can see the police officer holding his firearm while begging 23-year-old Aaron Hong to stop moving in the direction of the officers. But Hong appears to want the police officers to shoot him. He then charges one of the officers and 7 shots are fired. Soon after, he gets back up while yelling, "Kill me." He then overpowers the other officer while reaching for that officer's weapon, and that's when he is fatally shot.
Well, the whole scene unfolded in less than 3 minutes. The local police chief said that the officers were put in an impossible situation and released the video so that the citizens could see what the officers were confronting in taking a life, but did so reluctantly. Well, Israel has once again struck the capital city of Damascus in Syria, this time targeting Syrian and Iranian targets. Take a look at this video here obtained on some of the attacks, the missile launches, as they took place.
Seems like there's just, no peace of mind in an area like that. Syria's already been through a lot over the last several years with the airstrikes and what's been taking place with the United States and, of course, Russia being over there. It seems like the people just can't catch a break. And then Israel on top of that is kind of putting the icing on the cake, just making it like as one of the leaders said, a powder keg waiting to explode. Eventually we'll see some type of lashback from Syria.
Right, and this isn't the first time that Israel has done this.
No.
Quite a few times now they've engaged in these type of attacks against Syria.
That's right. In fact, in Syria's capital city of Damascus, more than a dozen were injured and 4 killed, including a baby, in a missile strike by Israel who were attacking military bases. Now, this according to Syrian state media. The Israel army has yet to comment. John Huddy with RT said that Israeli fighter jets launched missiles from Lebanese airspace at military positions in the central province of Homs, in the suburb of Damascus. It's not unusual for Israel to fly into Lebanese airspace to conduct airstrikes on targets in Syria.
Well, this isn't the first airstrike, as Israel has conducted them in May as well, and more than 1,000 such strikes in Damascus and Homs in the last few years. Now, this time Syria fired back with the wreckage of a Russian-made S-200 missile that was found on the island of Cyprus that was used to fire back but missed its target. Now, whether this latest strike is a sign of things to come is yet to be determined, but the fact that Russian-made missiles are being used is a real game changer.
And we know that we've reported in the past, at least in regards to Turkey, that's been a real issue for the United States in regards to these other countries acquiring and using Russian-made S-200, S-400, and S-500, so forth missiles. And of course, we're seeing them now in Syria as well. Well, right now we're going to take a look at some of the things that are taking place with Iran. Our field correspondent Larry McGee has some information for us regarding that, and Iran's response to United States pressure and how they're dealing with the push and the sanctions from the United States, along with some other things. Larry, what do you have for us?
The posturing between the U.S. and Iran hasn't at all let up, and many are now collectively wiping their brow after just narrowly escaping an all-out war between the two and all that that represents. After Tehran made the bold decision to shoot down an American drone, President Trump was poised to retaliate, but had a change of heart and called off the strike before it came to fruition. Going forward from the incident, however, one thing is clear now, if it hasn't been up until this point: Iran is not afraid. To go along with that, America is used to getting its way and believes itself to be much too powerful to accept no from anyone. These elements together spell an imminent fight between the two that has the potential to inflame the entire Mideast, if not the world. The underlying problems between the two nations have not been resolved. Analysts describe the issues as festering, and both sides are determined not to back down. The current U.S. administration, which has been very big on negotiating deals, says it would like to see a deal negotiated here as well. Iran believes the present administration's proposition, however, involves their economic subjugation and/or ruin, as well as regime change, and these are terms that Tehran is simply unwilling to accept. President Trump is reportedly hopeful that sanctions will eventually wear down the Persians' tenacity, snuff out their nuclear program, and drive them back to the table under U.S. terms. It was the U.S. who issued what Britain has called a demand to seize an Iranian tanker named the Grey Swan, and there is international controversy now since Britain did in fact choose to execute that command. The U.S. is said to be striving to exert maximum pressure on Iran, and so it was already monitoring the ship, which is reported to have loaded a cargo of oil off the Iranian coast en route to a refinery in Syria. The ship was intercepted at the British territory of Gibraltar, where it was met by a helicopter and boarded by 30 Royal Marines under the direction of the Gibraltar police. Iran, who was attempting to use an alternative route to deliver the oil as a means, some believe, of avoiding U.S. detection, is said to be very upset by the seizure and has reportedly called the British ambassador to the foreign ministry in Tehran. The members of BRICS have not called it quits in their collective bid to free themselves from the stranglehold of the petrodollar. The group recently held a meeting at the G20 where President Putin described their efforts to strengthen trade in their own currencies as going well. Two of the biggest players in the endeavor, China and Russia, have signed an agreement to take trade among them conducted in yuan and rubles from its current 10% up to 50%. One of the biggest obstacles to the BRICS effort has been SWIFT, however, the world's largest payment system, which is supposed to be neutral, but has shown itself vulnerable to U.S. pressure. Since the events that earned SWIFT the nation's distrust, however, several other alternative payment methods have been established by Russia and China, and the EU has also developed a platform reportedly aimed specifically at helping Iran. Analysts believe that if America, in trying to preserve the petrodollar, continues applying pressure through broad and sweeping sanctions, then we will only see an increase in groups like BRICS. The nations of the world are apparently tired of the tyranny of the petrodollar, but America has no intention of letting it falter, at least not without one hell of a fight. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. It's Han Jeff. Back to you.
Well, as China and Russia continue to make their moves to dump the dollar, now raising the percentage in which they're going to be trading in the yuan and the rubles, that, as Larry said, is really going to make the U.S., force the U.S. into decision what they're going to do. But as he said, they're not going to give that up without a fight. You know that the dollar has so much to do on the economy, and now you see nations, big ones, Russia and China, making moves to dump the dollar.
Yeah, people are kind of getting tired, as they say. It's losing its value throughout the international community.
Right. Well, the longstanding U.S. petrodollar is being questioned by Russian President Vladimir Putin as to whether it should remain the economic standard by which the world market buys and sells oil. Now, Putin spoke at against the U.S. currency's domination at an economic forum in St. Petersburg alongside Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Putin told those in attendance, "At this time, new economic centers have emerged. The role of regional currencies have risen. The balance of powers and interests have shifted. Obviously, those deep changes require adaptation on the part of international financial organizations and rethinking the role of the dollar.
Well, the Russian president called for deep reform, saying countries are losing trust in the dollar. He also expressed concerns about the global economy entering a trade wars climate, which he said his country wants no part in. Now, he made mention the pressure that the U.S. has put on Chinese tech giant Huawei to force it out of the global market.
Well, finally, President Putin accused Washington of seeking to, quote, extend its jurisdiction to the whole world, end quote.
Well, continuing with President Putin, he broke his own record for arriving late to meet with Pope Francis this week. Now, he arrived at the Pope's home over an hour late. As we recently reported, at their last meeting, he kept the Pope waiting for about 50 minutes. Now, the Russian president was met by George Gainswine, prefect of the pontifical household, who led him through the apostolic palace to the Pope's study.
The two greeted one another warmly, but there was an awkward moment where both Pope and Putin tried to enter the Pope's office at the same time through the narrow walkway. The Pope motioned for President Putin to go first, and he did. This was Putin's third visit to the Vatican, and it lasted for nearly an hour. The two leaders exchanged gifts, both having the same theme of peace. Putin gave the Pope a film about Michelangelo called Sin and an icon of St. Peter and Paul.
Well, the Pope presented President Putin with a medallion commemorating the end of World War I, as well as his annual message for peace, his apostolic exhortations on holiness and young people, and a document he signed in Abu Dhabi on dialogue with Muslims. Now, the Pope's final gift was a copy of an 18th century etching of the Vatican itself. Now, the Pope explained why he was giving it to Putin, quote, so you don't forget Rome, unquote. Now, Putin assured President Francis that he would put it somewhere important.
Really will. At the end of their meeting, the Pope thanked him for coming and asked President Putin to pray for him. Putin, in turn, thanked the Pope for his time and, quote, the very substantial, and interesting conversation, end quote. The President Putin wasn't finished at the Vatican. He also sat down with the Vatican Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin, for another 30 minutes.
Well, according to the Vatican-issued press release, the Pope and Putin spoke about the current situations in Venezuela, Ukraine, and Syria. Now, the situation of Catholics in Russia also came up during their dialogue, and an agreement was signed between the Vatican Hospital Bambino Gesù and the Russian pediatric hospitals.
About a week prior to Putin's visit to Rome, one of his country's newest warships, the Admiral Gorshkov, was docking in Cuba's capital city of Havana, just 90 miles from the American state of Florida. The Pentagon says it's a clear show of force by the Russians, but you have to look back even further in time to understand what's going on.
Well, after President Trump said he was planning to pull out of the historic INF treaty signed by Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987, Russia's deputy foreign minister warned there could be a new Cuban missile crisis if the U.S. chooses to deploy missiles back to Europe. Now, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty had led to the U.S. pulling missiles out of Europe, which eased the tensions with European and Asian countries.
But the White House has been accused of weapons buildup in Europe once again, which Moscow says could reignite one of the most dangerous conflicts seen during the Cold War. To flex its military might, Russia has sent its state-of-the-art warship complete with cruise missiles to the Cuban harbor, but even this impressive ship is not as distressing as a close call the USS Chancellorsville had with the Russian destroyer in the Western Pacific a few weeks ago. The American naval ship had to change its course to avoid colliding with that Russian vessel, and we showed video on that previously.
Right. Pretty close for those two enormous vessels to be, at that fast,
right.
Going right beside each other. Well, Moscow recently reported one of its fighter jets intercepted a U.S. B-52 bomber in the Black Sea. Now, the U.S. says the Russians are trying to create a propaganda war against the United States armed forces, but they say It's simply not true.
Russia's warship display followed a month-long 10,000 NATO troop war game exercise in the Baltic Sea, which involved 50 Allied warships. And as a response to Russia's threat to use limited nuclear weapons on the battlefield, the Pentagon announced plans to add new low-yield nuclear weapons to ballistic missile submarines.
Well, only his second day on the job, President Trump's new acting defense secretary, Mark Esper, flew to NATO headquarters for meetings about Russia and to drum up support against Iran. Well, Katan, we can see all these moves. The close call there in the between the two warships. Russia bringing their warship into Havana, Cuba. The U.S. now saying, after they pulled out of that INF treaty, now saying they're going to put low-yield tactical nukes on their submarines. All these are moves that show the direction that the nations are headed. I know that President Putin and the Pope Francis said they exchanged gifts of peace, but you can see the world is not heading in a peaceful direction. It's making plans for war, and the nations are surely making their plans and their alliances with one another to gear up for a war.
That's right. That's right.
If you'd like to find out more about these stories, you can contact the House of Yahweh, and when you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the Prophetic Word magazine and monthly newsletter. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can also call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites by going to Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, or Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can visit our website by going to YPNnews.com. You can email the House of Yahweh at info@yahweh.com. And for all calls outside the United States, please dial the number on your screen. Of course, don't forget to check out the free online 24/7 version of the Yisrael Says and Ask Yisrael study programs to aid you in studying and understanding the Holy Scriptures and the prophecies related to this time period. And you can find those by going to YisraelSays.com and AskYisrael.com.
Although the nations may be preparing for war, you can still have peace within yourself. Get ready for another exciting message from Yisrael Hawkins, who's up next. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.